Okay, so let's talk about Reconstruction in Texas. Reconstruction in the United States, and especially in Texas, really can be viewed as a second Civil War, a second um, phase of the Civil War, where the questions of freedom, questions of slavery, questions of the meaning of freedom, all get worked out, at least preliminarily. And Reconstruction, in that sense, is probably the most pivotal period of Texas history, especially when it comes to Texas government for reasons that we will talk about. Now, there are several questions about Reconstruction that you should ask yourself when we're starting out this lesson. On whose terms would the rebel states, the defeated states, re-enter the Union, re-enter the United States? What would the place be of those who had been formerly enslaved? They're free now. What would their place be? And what does freedom mean? Does freedom mean full citizenship, the right to vote, hold office, serve on juries? What does freedom mean? And in many ways, in the United States and in Texas, we are still arguing about what freedom means. Does freedom mean that the freedmen and women would be given economic assistance? Does it mean that they're free? Good luck, you're on your own. What does freedom mean? And in a very real sense, we are still arguing over these things even today. So, things to think about. Reconstruction began in Texas in earnest on June 17th, 1865, with the arrival of U.S. troops, occupation troops at Galveston and Marshall on June 17th. 2 days later, troops reached Texas under the command of General Gordon Granger to begin Reconstruction. Granger was informed that enslaved African Americans in Texas had not learned of the Emancipation Proclamation yet, and so there in Galveston on June 19th, 1865, Granger announced the Emancipation Proclamation, and of course the day has become known as Juneteenth within the United States and within Texas. It is Independence Day for African Americans. It's a day of rejoicing. Granger, though, it should be noted, did not promise anything to the formerly enslaved. He just proclaimed the Emancipation Proclamation, and that is noteworthy. Meanwhile, many enslavers resisted the end of the war, even though enslaved African Americans were free. As one enslaver put it, quote, "that don't make them rich," end quote. Most freedmen wanted only the opportunity to make a good life for themselves and their children, but that was going to be very difficult as enslavers increasingly used violence to impair the rights of the freedmen and women as they left slavery. That is a picture there of General Gordon Granger, the man who proclaimed Juneteenth. When we talk about Reconstruction, there are broadly speaking, two phases of Reconstruction. There was presidential Reconstruction and congressional Reconstruction. Presidential Reconstruction, of course, was the time period during which the President of the United States, starting with President Abraham Lincoln and after his death in April of 1865, President Andrew Johnson oversaw Reconstruction. And the congressional Reconstruction is when the Congress took control of the process from the President, from President Johnson. And so presidential Reconstruction, this first period, lasted from 1865 until 1867. Abraham Lincoln never made any provisions for the formerly enslaved in his Reconstruction plans. He didn't have time to. His successor, Andrew Johnson, cared even less about African Americans. In fact, Andrew Johnson hated the freedmen. And although he wanted slavery to end, beyond that, he didn't care for them at all. He didn't care about what happened to them. Andrew Johnson appointed Andrew Jackson Hamilton, a longtime Texas Unionist as the provisional governor of Texas. Hamilton's job was to reestablish government in Texas under the United States Constitution. Hamilton appointed interim state judges and sheriffs, and during the summer of 1865, he tried to appoint those that were loyal to the United States, but many of his appointments were also satisfactory to the former rebels as well. On September 5th, 1865, General Edgar Gregory reached Galveston as the head of the Freedmen's Bureau of Texas. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands was a federal government agency signed into law by President Lincoln in 1865, and their job was to enforce labor contracts between the former enslavers and the formerly enslaved, to establish schools, and to protect the freedmen from violence. Most white Texans resented the Freedmen Bureau's presence, but by January of 1866, Gregory had established 21 sub-commissioners and had begun to make the Freedmen's Bureau a major factor in Reconstruction, Texas. In November of 1865, Governor Hamilton called for an election on January 8th of the next year to choose delegates to a constitutional convention. Anyone who swore the oath was eligible to vote. That is, that anyone who swore loyalty to the United States. So most of the delegates elected were generally pro-Union, but had supported the Confederacy during the war. The convention adopted the Constitution of 1866, and that Constitution declared the secession ordinance null and void, repudiated the public debt, and recognized but did not ratify the 13th Amendment by removing slavery from the state constitution. The Constitution also promised rights to freedmen, but only if the state legislature passed laws to that effect. Oran Roberts, who was a delegate to that convention, Roberts, who was also the head of the Texas Secession Convention, declared, quote, "We must form a white man's government that will keep Sambo from the polls," end quote. So, the 1866 Constitution is clearly a white man's Constitution. Before voters had a chance to even vote on the new Constitution and new officials, the Reconstructionists in Texas split into radical Unionists, those who wanted to condemn secession and take a moderate stance toward the freedmen, led by A.J. Hamilton, and conservative Unionists who wanted to return to the United States with as little change as possible. The radicals put Elijah Pease forward as their candidate for governor, and the conservatives put forward James Throckmorton. James Throckmorton easily won the election. The new legislature elected Oran Roberts, a radical secessionist, and David G. Burnett, a Unionist but Confederate supporter, to the United States Senate. And of course, they were denied their seats, along with other former rebels, in 1866. The new legislature also refused to ratify the 13th or 14th Amendments. The 13th Amendment took effect anyway in December of 1865. And finally, the legislature passed what were known as black codes, like those that were adopted in other southern states, to deny equality to African Americans. African Americans could not serve on juries, testify against whites, vote, or hold elected office. They also could not share in the public school fund or intermarry with whites. The legislature also passed contract, vagrancy, and apprentice laws to make sure freedmen stayed subservient. The vagrancy law, for instance, allowed the police to arrest anyone who was, quote, idle, fine them, and then hire them out to pay the fine. Clearly, this is a condition very little changed from slavery. In 1866 and 67, the freedmen fared terribly. They complained of violence. Hundreds, if not thousands of them were murdered in Texas and across the South. They complained of broken contracts and being cheated, and Governor Throckmorton did exactly nothing about it. The complete and utter failure of presidential Reconstruction under President Andrew Johnson as well as Johnson's unpopularity with the U.S. Congress, led the Congress to take over Reconstruction. In the midterm congressional elections of 1866, radical Republicans swept into power in Congress, elected by a northern electorate disgusted at the unrepentant South. And in March of 1867, Congress passed the first of several Reconstruction acts designed to subjugate the rebels and bring about real Reconstruction. Under these laws, Texas would have to register all eligible voters, African Americans and whites, elect a convention to write a new constitution, establish new government under that constitution, ratify the 14th Amendment, and elect new senators and representatives. And then, if it so chose, Congress could allow Texas back into the United States. Texas and Louisiana were placed into the 5th Military District under General Philip Sheridan, stationed in New Orleans. Sheridan appointed General Charles Griffin to command Texas. Both Sheridan and Griffin were prepared to deal harshly with the secessionists. Sheridan quickly told Governor Throckmorton that the United States Army viewed his administration as provisional. In April of 1867, Sheridan declared that Throckmorton could not make any appointments or hold any elections. Later that month, Griffin declared that all Texas jurors had to swear to the fact that they had never supported the Confederacy. Judges reacted differently in Texas. Some complied with the order, some followed Governor Throckmorton in defying this order. Sheridan began by registering all voters. He excluded from office, per the orders of Congress, all government or military officials who had ever taken an oath to support the United States Constitution and then violated it during the war, all the way down to cemetery sextons. Sheridan appointed a 3-man panel for every county. One of the board members had to be a freedman, and registration of voters began in June and July of 1867. In the end, registration amounted to 59,633 whites and 49,479 African Americans. Some whites, anywhere from 7,000 to 12,000, refused to take part, and African Americans, who were only 30% of the state's population, were radically overrepresented at 45% of registered voters. In July of 1867, Congress gave the military almost unlimited powers, and Sheridan wasted little time in removing Governor Throckmorton as an impediment to Reconstruction. Sheridan replaced Throckmorton with former Governor Elijah Pease. Meanwhile, Griffin replaced Sheridan as commander of the 5th Military District, but died of yellow fever. General Joseph Reynolds replaced Griffin. Finally, in November of 1867, General Winfield Hancock, a Democrat who had little use for the radicals, exerted restraint over the Reconstruction government in Texas, but not before the state and government had been fundamentally altered. From February 10th to 14th, 1868, the people of Texas elected representatives to a constitutional convention. The results were a huge victory for the Texas Republican Party, which had organized on July 4th, 1867 in Houston. 82% of the newly enfranchised African Americans went to the polls and voted overwhelmingly for the convention and Republican candidates. Only 31% of registered whites went to the polls. The convention met in Austin on June 1st, 1868, and 78 of its 90 members were Republicans. Only 12 were carpetbaggers. 9 African Americans also served as delegates to the convention. Almost immediately, the Republicans split in the convention into moderates led by A.J. Hamilton and radicals led by Edmund J. Davis. They disagreed on 3 issues: ab initio, which would declare the ordinance of secession null and void all acts of the Texas legislature from 1861 to 67. It would also disenfranchise former Confederates and, of course, dividing Texas to create a new western state. The hope of the Republicans was that you could keep the rebels in eastern Texas and make a new Republican state out of western Texas. So these three issues are dividing the delegates. Conservatives opposed all three measures, that is, ab initio, disenfranchising former Confederates, and dividing Texas, and radicals supported all three. After 3 months, the convention ran out of money. They rejected ab initio, though, and they ordered a tax so they could meet again from December of 1868 to February of 1869. Moderate Republicans and conservatives defeated radicals on all three of the major issues at stake, but the Constitution of 1869, known as the Radical Constitution, had no provisions for disenfranchisement. All adult male African American men could vote, serve on juries, attend public schools, and testify against whites. The Constitution also centralized power in Austin in the hands of the governor, who would serve 4-year terms rather than 2-year terms. In the gubernatorial election of 1869, Edmund J. Davis, the radical Republican, defeated Andrew Jackson Hamilton, the moderate Republican, in a very close election. About 900 votes out of almost 80,000 cast. The new Constitution was also adopted by an overwhelming margin. Radical Republicans won majorities in both houses of the state legislature, and they also won seats in 3 of 4 of Texas's congressional districts. On January 8, 1870, General Reynolds appointed Edmund J. Davis and all of the other state officials to provisional office while he went about restoring Texas to the United States. The 12th legislature ratified the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and President Ulysses Grant signed a bill on March 30, 1867, ending military reconstruction in Texas. On April 16, 1870, General Reynolds returned all government to the civil authorities. The first problem that Governor Davis had to deal with was a lack of law and order. Bands of outlaws operated in the Big Thicket and the swamps and woods of southeast Texas. The Ku Klux Klan did not operate as a unified organization in Texas, but groups that were known as the Knights of the White Camellia and the Knights of the Rising Sun carried out acts of violence against freedmen in the eastern counties of the state. In June of 1870, the legislature passed a law creating a militia composed of all able-bodied men ages 18 to 45 and commanded by the governor to impose law and order and take over for any civil authorities who could not or would not do their duty. The legislature also passed a law allowing for a state police force of 258 men. Governor Davis also increased the number of judicial districts to deal with criminals, and he appointed 35 radical Republicans to the bench to man these new districts. Governor Davis also pointed out that the Constitution of 1869 called for the creation of taxpayer-supported public schools. The legislature passed a decentralized public school system in 1870, but that didn't work, and so in April of 1871, the legislature voted to create a highly centralized public school system. Attendance peaked in the 1872-73 year with an enrollment of 125,000, but the system drew opposition for educating African Americans as well as whites. The 12th legislature also passed several pieces of legislation aimed at increasing the governor's power and the hold of the Republican Party on the state. The 12th legislature in 1871 also provided for the first public institution of higher learning in the state, Texas Agricultural and Mechanical College. A committee headed by Governor Davis located the college near the town of Bryan, and in October of 1876, Texas A&M College opened with 106 students and 6 faculty members. During the 1870s, Governor Davis faced rising criticism from conservatives over taxes and issues of race. Conservatives complained about the new taxes to finance improved roads, bridges, and schools. They also complained that 40% of the state police force were African Americans. A taxpayers' convention met in Austin in 1871, and they condemned Governor Davis and his administration. Davis and the Republicans now faced the ire of angry white Texans. The Republicans began to lose their hold in 1871 when Democrats swept the elections for all 4 of Texas's congressional seats. In 1872, Horace Greeley won the presidential contest in Texas over the incumbent Republican, Ulysses Grant, and Democrats swept to victory in most of the state legislative races and congressional seats as well. The Democratic-controlled 13th legislature in 1873 met and began repealing most of the powers that Davis had enjoyed up to that point. The Republicans renominated Davis in 1873, but the Democrats, whose nominee was former Confederate Captain Richard Koch, only had to remind white Texans of the charges of tyranny and taxes that were levied against Davis. Koch overwhelmingly defeated Davis, as many African Americans did not turn out to vote due to intimidation. Davis prepared to leave office, but some Republicans raised a constitutional question to the election. The Constitution stated that the polls should be open for elections for 4 days. They interpreted a semicolon in a sentence to mean that the 4-day rule was an independent clause. Therefore, they said the election had been illegal. The Texas Supreme Court ruled in favor of Davis in the case of Ex parte Rodriguez, also known as the semicolon case. Democratic leaders insisted that Davis resign on January 8, 1874, 4 years after General Reynolds had installed him as provisional governor, but Davis refused. The Democrats had the legislature meet, and on January 11th, Davis wired President Grant asking him for help. Grant did not send help, and a local militia unit known as the Travis Rifles took control of the legislative chamber of the Capitol and inaugurated Governor Koch. On January 15th, Davis departed Austin. This ended Republican rule and placed Texas in the hands of men who called themselves Redeemers. The Democrats and former Confederates felt they had to repeal the radical Constitution of 1869 and adopt a new one. In August 1875, voters elected 90 delegates to a constitutional convention. 75 were Democrats. 40 of them belonged to the Grange, a farmers' organization dedicated to rolling back government control. The new Constitution, completed in 1875, reflected the desire of conservatives for a more decentralized government. Governors would be elected to 2-year terms, and the legislature would only meet every other year, as opposed to every year as before. They also reduced the power and scope of the judiciary, and they gutted and decentralized the public school system. On February 15, 1876, voters went to the polls and adopted the Constitution of 1876, which still serves as the Texas state constitution to this day. They also re-elected the incumbent Democratic governor, Richard Koch. On April 18, 1876, the new Constitution went into effect, wiping away the last vestiges of Reconstruction in Texas. So let's talk about the legacy of Reconstruction in Texas. Reconstruction changed very little in terms of power. In the end, the same men who had taken Texas out of the United States returned to power in Austin. Reconstruction provided African Americans with both hope and despair. It gave freedmen rights and freedoms with which they made remarkable progress in a very short time. Freedmen took up the mantle of citizens by voting and serving on juries. They also made economic progress. Some ended up as landless sharecroppers, but according to the 1880 census, 20% of African American farmers owned their own land, which was a stunning statistic considering that they had come out of slavery with nothing. The census also showed that freedmen generally lived in nuclear families with father, mother, and children, which was also a remarkable trend considering what had occurred during slavery. Reconstruction allowed at least one generation of freedmen to improve themselves. But once Reconstruction ended, African Americans faced an uncertain future with the return of former Confederates to power. Reconstruction quickly entered Texas history as the darkest part of the state's past, with barely literate African Americans and corrupt carpetbaggers running roughshod over the freedoms of white Texans. But was that really the case? The allegations of carpetbaggers ruining the state are completely unfounded. The wealthy did not have to give up their status. They continued to be wealthy before and after the Civil War. The popular interpretation of Reconstruction states that Texas did not need to give equal political and civil rights to all of its citizens after 1865, and that the national government should not have forced them to, and that the Davis administration, which pursued those goals, should have been destroyed. The Redeemers interpreted Reconstruction this way, and for a majority of the 19th and 20th centuries, most white Texans agreed, which led directly to popular opposition to taxing and spending for public purposes and the lack of concern for civil rights that has characterized Texas politics from the 1870s onward.